So thank you all for coming today to the University of New Hampshire School of Law for a presentation on corruption in college basketball and some of the legal issues that have come up in recent weeks over coaches, sneaker executives, and financial advisors who have been charged with crimes related to their alleged participation in conspiracies involving recruitment of athletes to certain colleges and recruitment of athletes to sign with certain financial advisors before they enter the NBA. My name is Michael McCann. I'm the Associate Dean of Academic Affairs here at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. I also direct the Sports and Entertainment Law Institute. I will talk for a little bit, and then I'm going to turn it over to Luke Bonner. Luke is a former professional basketball player and a college basketball star who has been instrumental in organizing the rights for college athletes. Luke will provide his perspective on what it's like to have been a player in this industry and also some of the work that he has done since retiring from the sport. So he'll provide really a great firsthand account. And we'll also field questions later on as well. We know we only have an hour, so we'll try to be concise and go from there. So thanks all for coming. I think as an initial question, it's worth asking, why aren't college athletes paid? This is sort of the crux of the story, and it's one that's explained by a system of rules that the NCAA has, and that system is called amateurism. Amateurism prohibits the payment of college athletes for their wages, for their recruitment, and it also, although this has changed because of the Ed O'Bannon case, it also restricts their ability to gain compensation for their name, image, and likeness. Though there's an asterisk next to that because college athletes can rely on the O'Bannon decision to do so, and that could set up a separate fight with the NCAA. But for now, what this criminal prosecution, and there's actually 3 separate complaints that have been filed by the Justice Department, the central argument is that those who have control over college resources, namely coaches, assistant coaches so far, have conspired to defraud universities of funding that the federal government provided. So the federal government provides grants and other resources to colleges, and the Justice Department believes that these coaches have mishandled those funds with the intent of depriving universities and by extension the federal government of their resources. They have gotten gains that are unlawful, supposedly. And those gains come from alleged conspiracies between an assistant coach, so far, there could be head coaches down the line, an assistant coach who reaches out to perhaps a financial advisor that he knows. A financial advisor tells him, look, we really want you to direct this future NBA player to sign with us after he leaves college. So the assistant coach tries to convince that player to sign with a particular financial advisor. The assistant coach receives money. The assistant coach also is involved with directing money and resources to top recruits who are thinking about which college, high school recruits who are thinking about which college they want to go play college basketball for. And the allegation is, in particular, Adidas has joined hands with coaches to direct certain players to certain programs, programs that are sponsored by that shoe company. And we know that about 5 schools have been implicated, but the thinking is that there are many more that have been engaged in these practices. So, it's worth asking, is this corruption, right? Certainly, as I just described it, it sounds really corrupt. But put yourself in a different position for a second. Let's say this was a young actor or a musician that was the target of these influences. Could he or she get paid for their talents? Yeah, and it would be over the table, right? It would be taxed, and there wouldn't be this nefarious stigma that goes along to it. Or how about a golfer or a tennis player, can they turn pro before high school ends? Sure. And we don't say, oh, what about these corrupt practices? What are they going to do? How are they going to handle it? Even baseball players and hockey players can turn pro right out of high school. And it really actually lends itself to a dynamic where there are only 3 major professional leagues where players can't turn pro right out of high school. Those 3 leagues are the NFL, the NBA, and the WNBA. Now, Professor Michael Dubey is here. Professor Dubey was an instrumental attorney in Maurice Claret's lawsuit against the NFL over its age restriction. And that stems from the NFL's rule that you have to be 3 years out of high school before you're eligible for the NFL draft. I mean, think about how many injuries you could suffer until then. Even in the NBA, for years, NBA players could go directly from high school to the NBA, but then in 2005, that was changed so that players had to take 1 year after high school. Many of them go on to play in college for a year, and then they go pro. It's worth asking, what system is this protecting? Is it helping colleges? Yeah, the colleges get the player for a year, and that player can go make a lot of money for the school. But is that pro education? A year of college, but it's not even really a year of college, right? Because they go to class in the fall, and then in the spring semester when the season ends, they turn pro they declare for the NBA draft, and now they're going out, they drop classes. So there's really like a semester of college. As an educator, it just strikes me as that I don't know how that promotes education to have them taking a semester's worth of college classes when they could be making money during that time. The WNBA is actually the most restrictive age restriction, where a player has to be either 22 college graduate, or either 22 or a college graduate if you're an American, but if you're foreign, you can be 20 and there's no educational requirement. It's interesting when you look at basketball, where only in the US do we have this restriction that you can't be a pro player when you're young. If you go to Europe, there are pro players who are 14 and 15 years old, and they have tutors, and they go on and do just fine. We have this unique system in the United States where we essentially don't require you to go to college, but we direct you in that direction for a very brief period of time. So these criminal charges relate to this environment where coaches and shoe executives are trying to convince players under the table, right? So it has the stigma, it's not taxed. We say somebody who takes a payment under the table that they're somehow wrong. But again, in any other sport other than football, these would be over-the-table payments. It's only the unique nature of these sports that lead to this conspiracy. Why is it a federal charge? Because of alleged federal interstate activity. In order for the federal government to have a role, there has to be some kind of interstate activity. Here being the payments were made through bank accounts across state lines. And the conspiracy is, again, among the actors that we've already talked about. Bribes is the government's central thesis, that these are unlawful bribes. Why are they unlawful? Well, they clearly violate NCAA rules, but that doesn't make something unlawful, right? The NCAA is a private actor. Because something violates an NCAA rule doesn't make it illegal. What makes it illegal, according to the federal government, is that there has been a deprivation of federal resources at the college level because colleges have received funding. That funding is now being misused by assistant coaches and others. Where will this go? I think we have to ask ourselves, this is not the end of the story, in that when assistant coaches are facing 50 to 70 years in prison, it's worth wondering how they might respond to that. Because it's worth, in all likelihood, the federal government isn't interested in an assistant coach here or there. They're most likely interested in the head coach or the athletic director or maybe the university president. To what extent does an assistant coach direct the conspiracy? You might say it's probably not the assistant coach, and maybe Luke can talk about this. Who's actually calling the shots in a college basketball program? Is it one of several assistants, or is it the head coach? And if it's the head coach, the assistant coach could be in a position to cut a deal with the government and testify against the head coach and maybe provide records, maybe provide emails and text messages. The government has at least one informant. The informant has provided, from what we understand, recordings of meetings in which the alleged criminals have talked about partaking in the conspiracy. But the assistant coach who's been charged, it wouldn't shock me if the assistant coach, who previously might have been very loyal to the head coach, right? When the NCAA is going after you, the fear is you might be suspended. When the federal government's going after you, the fear is that you're going to spend decades of your life in prison. That's I think, a fairly more significant fear. And I have a feeling that those who have been charged the list of those who have been charged is going to change. What about the players that have been implicated? Will they face criminal charges? Technically, they could, because they're part of the conspiracy. Either they or their parents have received money through an unlawful conspiracy. I don't think they're going to be charged. I would be surprised. Certainly, the government has not expressed that those who are the target are the 17 and 18-year-old players who might come from disadvantaged backgrounds and are now being shown $100,000. Again, money that if they were playing in a different sport would be over the table. I have a feeling that as long as they're cooperative and they're providing materials, they will not be charged, but we don't know that. What will the NCAA do with those athletes? Well, one has been suspended by his school indefinitely, but I think the NCAA has to be pretty cautious here, because if the NCAA goes after the athletes, one, there's the optics of that, where most in the public would say, that's pretty disheartening to think that these athletes who are young individuals that have only done what I think anybody in their position, or many people in their position, would likely do. But more than that, they may have evidence that ties others to a conspiracy, and that could potentially be threatening to the NCAA. What will be the future of college coaches? Well, one, I think we're going to see way more scrutiny by athletic directors of college coaches. I think it's just a matter of time before we see a very different dynamic where for years some of the elite college coaches have sort of been on islands with the university as the mainland, if you will, where they're doing their own thing. I have a feeling that's going to change, because once we start seeing universities realize the potential civil exposure, universities could get sued by the athletes who have been implicated and others who might be implicated in these controversies. What will happen in terms of other sports? Could college football be implicated? Sure. I think it's possible. We haven't yet seen the end of this story. As I mentioned before, I'm sure there are others that will be charged as part of the conspiracy. And if it's occurring at the college basketball level, it stands to reason that it could occur at college football. And we'll certainly talk about that as the lecture goes on. What about schools? Should they worry about their associations with certain apparel and sneaker companies? You bet, because if we know of one, or I guess two executives at one shoe company that have been accused of wrongdoing, what's to think that this isn't occurring more prevalently? I mean, it's not a mystery that this corruption occurred, right? When these charges came out, people were like, oh, I can't believe this. I thought it was so pure. I mean, nobody had that reaction. The reaction was, wow, the federal government's actually going after this. It's not just the NCAA anymore. So for years, this has been going on, maybe decades. And I have a feeling it's certainly not going to end because of this. Should we expect college coaches to bolt for the pros? I have a feeling we're going to see a number of coaches look at this new landscape in college and say, I don't want to deal with people like me, really, right? I'm an academic administrator. I'm probably an annoying presence to a college coach, right? Because I focus on things like compliance and oversight and transparency. There's a new ball game coming up for coaches, and they may not like to deal with it. But at this point, why don't we take a change of pace and go over to Luke Bonner, who will now talk about some of his own experiences in his own thoughts. So without further ado, Luke Bonner.
Thanks, Mike, for having me here in Concord, New Hampshire. Heck of a storm we had last night over here. So, excited for all you guys who have made it through the weather to come out. I'd like this to be more of a discussion, if that's possible. But I think the biggest thing, as Mike was mentioning, was how when this news hit that the FBI is involved in this case, that was like the biggest shock. This is criminal activity. I don't think anyone had any idea, of the people that are being implicated, that they were potentially committing a crime. Certainly, many of them knew or were aware that they're, risking their jobs or, in violating NCAA rules. But I would be absolutely shocked if anyone was aware that there were potential, federal crimes being committed. Because this is probably like decades of activity that's happening where people get jobs and they are told how to do their job and, they're doing it. So I think that was like the biggest shock for me. The thing I have a problem with is the way that this is really coming across as a crime. When you consider on the coach's side, it's totally common practice for universities to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on high-end executive search firms, to have headhunters, to recruit coaches, to pay them millions of dollars, where coaches can really dictate really minute details of their contract and buyouts, all the way down to what music gets played at practices. I saw that was listed in a college football contract recently. So it's just interesting when you talk about the players, all of a sudden, why is everyone so up in arms? Like, my opinion is like, who cares? Like, if you're clearly worth the money, then because the coaches are paying you that to you. So like that's one of the things is like, in all of the past lawsuits, there's obviously like a cap on how much you can make as an athlete. A lot of the discussion is should college athletes be paid? The reality is you're already paid. You go to the college, you play your sport, you go to practice, you go to class. Your compensation is an illegally price fixed salary of grant and aid and unlimited meal plan and a pair of sweatpants. So my thing is you're already paid. It's just should the NCAA be allowed to cap what that pay is? And in a lot of like previous lawsuits up to this point, it's going to be interesting because a lot of the NCAA arguments have been around like that that's fair market value or they've done studies on how fans won't watch if the athletes are paid. Well, we know they're paid now. Let's take a look at Louisville basketball attendance this year and see if that holds up, because I'm willing to expect good crowds in Louisville throughout the year. But yeah, I mean it's one of those things. It's too bad that there's this really over a century of propaganda towards college athletes and amateurism that you're up against with this. So whenever you're talking about the athletes getting paid, there's still people that just jump up in arms and for whatever reason see that as counter to education, which last I checked, I don't think you have to be like, completely broke to be able to get a good education. But yeah, so I mean, I want to like open this up for discussion really. But from my experience, it's going to be, what I think is going to be the most fascinating is in terms of the fallout, is you're already seeing a lot of college coaches, even some old timers that are kind of institutional, figures, shifting their dialogue. You got to keep in mind these guys have like the top PR people in the world, and you can already feel a shift in how they're. And even like you take a look at what Coach K is talking about. All of a sudden, he's very making slight shifts to talk about how players are worth. Maybe they are worth more than a scholarship. And it's just interesting, like, well, they weren't 3 years ago, so what happened? And so I think there's going to be an opportunity where people on my side of the boat, where I think that there needs to be some sort of legitimate player representation, a players association. You were talking about the players that are implicated in this. They have no real course of action to dispute anything. They have no real, way to appeal or have an arbitration, whatever it's going to be. And so on my side of things, people are hopeful that this is going to, shake out, and all of a sudden it's going to be like, the players are going to, get their fair market value. They're going to have a system in place, so they're getting health care and benefits and negotiating over these things. On the other side, though, I think they're just as hopeful. The amateurism thumpers are pretty excited because this presents an opportunity to appear like you're doubling down on cleaning up college sports. You've seen, college basketball. They've already created a college basketball commission, which is, kind of fascinating as well. There's a 14-person commission headed up by Condoleezza Rice, and there's not one person on that commission that's a current player, which is pretty telling. And there's no real recent players who have challenged, publicly challenged status quo or how the NCAA works. And you have John Thompson III on there, who's his dad's been a Nike board member since 1991. And when you're talking about the root of the cause being some of the most high-profile people being implicated are sneaker company executives. It just seems like it's a PR move, but is there any intention for legitimate change? So that's one of my concerns, is that you might see literally the U.S. government and politicians get involved in this. And I've spoken with a lot of politicians in the past about this subject, and when you speak kind of logically, I think a lot of people understand it. They understand it, but depending on how you're coming at it, all politicians have had a high level of education and have a view of college athletics being pure and whatever. I don't know that they necessarily understand the intricacies of the landscape of sports from grassroots on up. So I think you have a potential to really double down on this concept of amateurism, throughout this. I know in the past the NCAA has talked about trying to become antitrust exempt and get all that stuff. So it could present an opportunity for them to go after that. On the other hand, there's a lot of optimism on my side of things that this could improve for the better for the players. And in terms of the players, one of the things that bothers me the most about the NCAA when stuff like this happens is all too often the players end up becoming the collateral that colleges use and that the NCAA uses to punish colleges. So as soon as this broke and, Team A or whatever it was very obviously Louisville, and then you saw that, Rick Pitino got fired, Tom Jurich got fired. There's, pretty high profile people in the basketball world, different reporters and stuff, they're calling for the death penalty of Louisville basketball. And, that hasn't happened in, 30 years at this point? And it's just interesting because, who does the death penalty really, really hurt at its root? And the answer is the players. You remove scholarships, right? You ban a team from competition for a year or two. So you think of a 4-year college experience, that's 25 to 50% of your entire career. People will say well, you can transfer. Well, why should I have to transfer from a university? If it's not my first choice? That's still putting a lot of onus on the player, even if you can transfer. And then there's other elements to a death penalty which actually make more sense, and it's removal of executives and administrators from NCAA voting committees, removal from or loss of revenue for home games and stuff like that. But really, it's it lists 4 bullet points, and 2 of them just are smack, affect the players, and that's a huge issue. And honestly, most of the players probably have nothing to do with this and don't even know about it. So hopefully there's there's a solution to stuff like that to not have such an impact on the athletes themselves. But yeah, I mean, if you guys want to ask any questions, I think Michael's got a mic that he's going to pass around. And
Yeah, so there's a mute button on this. If you could just hit mute so that it's live, and Luke and I will be happy to field questions. No? Ceiling, so, okay, so we're not going to do that. So, but if you can ask us questions and we'll repeat the question. Yep, Mr. Bond.
I know most people in this room weren't alive when the Olympics were 50s and 60s, but they were amateurs. And the Russians would bring professional hockey players in, and we'd get beat, and then everybody like, well, they're not using amateurs. Is this like the beginning of that? I mean, is that similar to college athletics?
yeah, so the question is around the Olympic model versus how the Olympic model shifted, and they started to create trust funds where amateurs could withdraw money for like approved training expenses and stuff like that, and basically how that shifted from the 50s to now we're at, and LeBron James is playing in the Olympics. So the question is around like could we see something like that start to happen in college athletics? I would say that I think we're at like a tipping point right now, where even when I was in college, I mean, it's already kind of a long time since I played, and I was still in the era of like $1 billion TV deal for March Madness. But as of like when I was doing research on player rights issues in 2006, 2007, there was the Jason White class action suit against the NCAA where there was supposed to be a pool of money available for players to withdraw for different expenses. And so I was doing research on that and seeing like how many student athletes, I hate that word, how many college athletes at different universities were able to access this, and like basically no one was. But as I was doing that, I felt like I was like doing a covert operation, and like no one could know what I was doing or know that I had these thoughts of like the NCAA is bad and all this stuff, to where we're at right now. And there's just like, we're having this discussion right now, at one of the top law schools in the country.
Right.
And just, I think that we're at that tipping point where something is going to happen, and how that happens and what it exists as 20 years from now versus today, I think is going to be very different.
I agree, and I think that what we've seen is the litigation process be used to counter the NCAA, because it doesn't look like the NCAA does a whole lot unless they're taken to court. I mean, literally, I think we've seen a passive entity by and large, unless there's an actual attempt to change rules through the court process. And there are pretty influential cases. The Ed O'Bannon case was probably the most important in that it ensured that players will receive a right to compensation for their name, image, and likeness when they're used in commercial products like video games and classic broadcasts and apparel. And it's really important that the case had been brought, because if it hadn't, I don't think the NCAA would have changed its rules about offering full cost of attendance to college athletes. That case really led the NCAA to make a fairly significant change. And as a plug, Ed O'Bannon and I are collaborating on a book. Court Justice comes out February 6th. And I appreciate the plug for the law school, too. Look at our bar passage rates and employment rates. They are literally off the charts.
You should see the fall foliage outside.
Right. But the other case that's in the works is the Jenkins case against the NCAA. And the Jenkins case is brought by attorney Jeffrey Kessler, who many here in New England know as a lawyer for Tom Brady in the Deflategate case. And the Jenkins case argues that when colleges and the NCAA and conferences join hands to limit the value of athletic scholarships to tuition, room, board, books, and other modest expenses, that in and of itself is an antitrust conspiracy. In that, what would players get if they could negotiate with schools for the value of their scholarship? I mean, think of some of the best recruits in the country. I just remember when Jameis Winston was a college football recruit, literally schools were or he was a once-in-a-generation type talent. What would he have gotten if Alabama and Florida State and other schools had to bid against each other through an athletic scholarship? Clearly more than the value of an athletic scholarship that's limited to tuition, room, board, and books. So these are pretty important cases, and Luke referenced players can't unionize because they're not employees. Well, they can't. They can form a trade association, but they can't be. They're not union. They're under the federal labor law. They can't be employees, as it's been interpreted so far. But Northwestern football players brought a petition arguing that they were employees. Now, the National Labor Relations Board, for lack of a better expression, punted on it by holding that it didn't want to issue a game-changing decision because of the imbalance between private and public schools. I don't know. I don't really buy that because it's done so in the context of graduate students teaching courses. It isn't as if this is some unprecedented thing. But in any event, I would expect that we'll see other challenges over whether or not college athletes are employees rather than only being students. Can you be an employee and a student? Sure. I mean, it's not as if that's conceptually impossible. And even if these are difficult issues to work out, I've never thought that something hard is a defense, right? We never say, oh, it's too complex. I mean, we've sent somebody to the moon. We've done all sorts of things that require pretty ingenious thinking. So the fact that it could be hard to figure out a system, to me, isn't a reason not to do it.
Yeah, and you referenced this too, in terms of like what Jameis Winston could have theoretically been worth. And one of the things that kind of bothers me as a player is within all of this, the NCAA likes to play the victim, and like the schools play the victim. Like, oh, what has happened? When in reality, it's like their own system. They're the ones that created this system, which is, as a result of suppressing compensation to the athletes, all these, auxiliary markets are emerging, from prostitutes to insane lockers. Like at University of Texas, they have, thousands of dollars on each football locker, and they're coming up with all these different ways to attract talent. And coaches are on the road, year-round recruiting. Well, it's like your job would be so much easier if you could just pay someone fair market value.
It just shows the money's there, right?
Yeah.
It shows they're spending it on everything but the players, right? They're spending it on $11 million a year coaches, like Luke mentioned, these athletic facilities that are maybe better than pro teams' athletic facilities. They're spending it on all sorts of crazy I mean, the money's there. It's being spent. It's not as if, they're all broke, right? I mean, I know that's the narrative, but if they're spending all this money, it's just a telltale sign that it's not true. You had your hand up, yeah.
Thank you. Well, I'm a former college athlete, so just thank you for bringing this to campus. It's cool. I was wondering what your thoughts were on just like intersectionality in terms of what we've been seeing with like Colin Kaepernick and just the WNBA with the Black Lives Matter. Both of you, I guess, just how do you think politics can influence sports, vice versa?
Yeah, so the question was about intersectionality between what Colin Kaepernick's been doing and Black Lives Matter, and how that plays out in college athletics. I actually think it's a lot harder to be vocal as a college athlete than as a professional athlete. I mean, this is, somewhat, just anecdotal, but from my experience, when I got to a professional level, it's a job and you're responsible for yourself. And that was like the most exhilarating thing ever. Whereas, you're a college athlete, I'm sure if one of your teammates skipped class, frequently it's the whole team is getting up the next morning at 5 a.m. and running. And so like really at the college level, you are owned by your coaches way more than at even the professional level. And so that's an area where, you have stricter team rules and all this stuff, and no players, or I mean some are, but most players aren't going to want to risk, playing time or, rocking the boat at all while you're in college, because it's really there's such a power dynamic at play that it's really hard to challenge that when when you're an active player. It, you saw at Missouri though, like, in terms of Black Lives Matter stuff, when the football team threatened to not play a football game, and you had a student who was already on hunger strike, right? And the university wasn't doing anything to implement any sort of change at the college. But as soon as the football team says we might not play on Saturday, they granted everything. So I thought that was like really messed up, but also it really illustrates how much power players really do have.
Yeah, as Luke was mentioning, it's the boycott. That's really the power of a college athlete to influence a rule, is to say, we all won't show up, sort of like a strike with professional athletes. But as Luke mentioned, it's really hard for college athletes to do that. And there's no organized entity, right? If they were in a union, perhaps they could better collectively address those kinds of issues. Where you mentioned Colin Kaepernick, the fact that the Players Association in the NFL, it can be criticized and all of that about whether players should get more, but it's an entity that provides a vehicle to negotiate with the NFL over the issue of the national anthem. And similarly, to respond to remarks by President Trump and others about the national anthem. I think it's hard for players, and some have done it, Kaepernick being the prime example, but I think generally it's hard for players to maybe risk everything that has made them who they are in terms of their professional, or in the case of college athletes, their athletic talent, over social issues. So it's really important to have some kind of entity that can advocate for them.
And I think that's one of the issues too, is, I referenced like when you're in college, you're way more owned by your coaches. Your days are scheduled from 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. You know it. And that's an area where I find it very hard to believe that Rick Pitino has no idea what's going on with this stuff. Who knows? Maybe he doesn't. But yeah, like that's just like you're just so controlled by those things. And players, without an entity, I don't think most of the players understand, labor issues or how they're being exploited to the fullest, to be honest. Not to keep talking about Louisville, but when they had their season, they were banned from postseason play, was it 2 or 3 years ago? When Donovan Mitchell, I think, was a freshman, for stuff that dated back to like when he was in like 7th grade, right? It clearly has nothing to do with him. Yet they were, number 1 in the country on their way to a great season, and their season got pulled out from them in February. They canceled postseason. When stuff like that happens, I wish that there was more of an understanding from overall players that you need to stand up for Louisville, because player at UNH, you might be next. Like there's that's a precedent being set there, and you shouldn't stand for something like that, where your whole team is losing 25% of its career over something that happened 5-10 years ago.
Some of this stems from a lack of incentive that free education that the free education gives, especially in basketball with one and done. A lot of these kids who go to Kentucky or some of these big name schools, there's no incentive of a free education really for them, because they're there for 1 year, so they get 30 credits and then they're leaving for a professional program. Do you think that has led to sort of, I guess, more of a prevalence or a better seen prevalence going from all the way back to Marcus Camby to now?
So the question is about the one and done, the impact of one and dones in college basketball on corruption. Has it exacerbated the problem because the player is only there for a year, and really it's less than a year, right? Because the player plays in the fall, goes to class in the fall, and then in the spring, once he declares for the NBA draft, he's out. So it's really a semester of school. Sure, I think that the one and done phenomenon does exacerbate the problem, because there's no real relationship between the college athlete and the school beyond playing basketball. That taking courses in that fall semester are just instrumental for purposes of eligibility. And it puts the school in a position where its goal, I think, in many cases, is to make as much money as possible off that player for the one season that he's there and make sure that he's eligible to play. I'm sure that it affects oversight of what the player is doing. The player doesn't have the same set of incentives knowing that he's not coming back the following year. And frankly, if the player were in the NBA earning a contract, it's probably where he should be in that first year, or at least playing in some other professional league. So, yeah, I think the fact that the nexus between the athlete and the school is so tenuous, it's really a semester of school, certainly doesn't advance oversight over what that player is doing and influences over that player. And it makes you wonder whether that affects the coaches that are supposed to be watching out for that player as well.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of just like another angle on that too. First of all, it's not like a free education. Like if you go to walk on campus and you don't go to a single workout, you're gonna lose your scholarship. It's a service for a service. And I remember having a coach, trying to tell us like make sure we went to class by saying like you don't go to class, you're not getting paid. Like that's what I'm saying, which is a very direct way of putting it, and it actually kind of makes a lot of sense. But just like also in terms of like the current scandal around it, it's just kind of interesting. I don't know the specifics of the assistant coaches that are in trouble and stuff, but in terms of offering career advice and steering someone to an agent or a player to an agent and stuff like that, that's kind of like important. Like you need that as a player if you have someone you can trust. So like I don't know the legal element of that, but like maybe they needed to disclose if they're getting like a kickback, a finder's fee. Maybe that's the issue. But it's just like for whatever reason we view that as like this like super bad thing to like advise some of these players and let them test the waters and meet agents and stuff like that. Where you talked about college hockey, when I was at UMass, I had classmates who were on the hockey team who they have already been drafted, by NHL teams out of club hockey, and they know as soon as they walk off campus, they have a $250,000 signing bonus in their back pocket, and that's not an issue. One of those guys still never really went to class, but yeah, I mean, I think it does kind of exacerbate the level of how do you get someone to go to class when that's not the education they need. They need a different type of education to be prepared for a professional basketball life.
And just when a school retires a player's jersey after he was there a semester, I mean, what is that really saying about education?
I'm still waiting for my call from West Virginia on that one.
Maybe it will come. Anyway. Yes.
So I attended the University of Texas, so I've seen the locker rooms firsthand, the dorms and the cafeterias as well, and they're amazing. The basketball players in each of their rooms have big flat screen TVs. So my question is there an unfair competition argument to be made because schools like the University of Texas can essentially build a hotel to recruit players, whereas maybe a school with less financial resources couldn't do that, but could compensate the player with just money?
Yeah, I think that's one of the arguments that gets made a lot is like about competitive balance. Like, oh, if Texas can pay their players, 6-7 figures, what about UNH? Well, it's like, well, have you seen UNH's facilities versus Texas facilities? That imbalance already exists, and potentially it could even make things more competitive if I can go be the man in some market and make more money rather than being the 10th man in Austin. Yeah, who knows? But that competitive imbalance, I think that argument is just so like invalid at this point. When you're talking, the private jets that Kentucky's flying on versus the charter bus that I'll start talking about Maine. That Maine is going on. So
Well, and we don't, you mentioned that argument serious. We don't hear about it with academic issues, right? We don't say, well, look at Harvard's endowment of whatever they have. That's not fair. We don't say, well, look at the science building at one particular school versus ours. We only hear this argument with sports, where this competitive balance that if one school has greater resources, it's somehow going to disadvantage others. As Luke mentioned, it's already going on. I don't think the idea of players receiving some kind of compensation would change that competitive balance. I still think schools like Alabama for football, and Duke for basketball, whatever ones you want to plug in, they would still be in charge and leading the way for the top recruits in any system that we come up with. And it's really about how the player is affected through the system, I think. Thank you. Yes.
I was wondering if you could talk about AAU ball and how these shoe companies are sponsoring all these different circuits and everything, and how that might have affected this and how that might be affected in the future.
Yeah, so the question is about the AAU circuits and how sneaker companies, power kind of has impacted all of this. And, that's a big thing right there. I remember getting my first pair of like free Adidas in, 6th, 7th grade. Yeah.
Your dad says otherwise.
But that's an area where there's really, the United States in general has a lot, there's a lot of stuff happening on the grassroots level right now. And I'm curious to see what is going to happen as a result of this. There are some people predicting that maybe the NBA or USA Basketball really takes a more hands-on approach and captures some of that. And all this stuff might even scare away certain companies from being as active as they have been for the time being, like maybe for like a year or two. I honestly, I'm a little less optimistic. I think that some people are going to get in trouble, and it's basically going to be status quo. It's constantly changing anyway. Like, so my brother's 5 years older than me. When he was at Adidas big time tournament in Vegas, you're sitting with all the coaches. You're just kind of all intermingled. By the time I was there, it's like you're completely roped off. Parents on this side, coaches on this side, no interaction, nothing. Which also is like really hard. How do you like evaluate a coach or a player truly if you can't even like meet and talk to them? But in terms of like the power that the sneaker companies have, you have EYBL, you have Adidas has their set of tournaments and stuff, and there's not much regulation there, and there has been known through all this stuff of like money changing hands. It's not necessarily going to a player or the player's family. Like it's just you have no idea. There's a lot of different coaches, and that it's not like there's like a process for certification or whatever. Not that there necessarily needs to be, but anyone can have an AU team. A lot of them are 501c3 nonprofits, which has, I think, gotten some attention as well. And yeah, I think it's gonna be, that to me is the most interesting thing. I think over the next few weeks as more news comes out, like how is this going to impact grassroots basketball in the United States? The other side of that too is that sneaker money allows a lot of low-income families to participate. I mean, that's a reality too. It gets guys out to tournaments and covers expenses and stuff like that. And we've seen a trend in youth sports where, there's kind of a socioeconomic divide, and wealthier kids are able to hire. There's a professionalization, I guess, of youth sports where wealthier families are able to hire the best trainers and kind of become the best players. And so while a lot of people are viewing this stuff as kind of like bad, there is definitely an element to it that it broadens the game and allows a lot of underprivileged kids to play the sport and get seen.
Yeah, just to add, I think Luke hits at another possibility of charges that we could see out of this case, which would be tax fraud and tax evasion. The fact that these payments were made without reporting them to the IRS or to the state Department of Revenue, whatever state they're in. We could see a whole subset of charges related to the issue of unreported gains. But I also think your question about AAU basketball hits at the relationship between shoe companies and AAU basketball, and the fact that there could be people in AAU basketball who maybe they're not charged, but they become witnesses in the criminal cases. And we could see all sorts of people become witnesses. And I think that would have a big effect on basketball. Once you become a witness, I have a feeling people are going to become very cautious And maybe before they were more cavalier with how they went about recruiting players and interacting with players. I think once there's word that you could be a witness in a case, even if the FBI wants to talk to you, that's going to be really intimidating. So I think we could see a much more restrained AAU basketball, even if the individuals in it aren't charged with crimes, to any extent that they're related to the cases. I think it's going to affect the way they do things.
Just to piggyback on that a little bit too, it's interesting too that in terms of like the sneaker company presence and the grassroots basketball scene, there's been like a lot more hands-on interaction with like those sneaker companies, like, you know, marquee players, where they're doing different skill development camps that are during dead periods. There's no college coaches there or anything, but like truly, you know, grassroots player development stuff. So like those sorts of things, I would be ashamed to see those go as like as a basketball fan. And yeah, I mean there's obviously like the shady side, but there's also a lot of good that, you know, and a lot of like there's a big economy behind it. There's a lot of honest, hardworking people that's their livelihood that theoretically could be impacted, you know, in a tangential way, but like very severe way. So you know, it's one of the parts that like really upsets me the most. Like a lot of the best people I know that are my lifelong friends I've met through that circuit.
Abby, you had your hand up.
Could you both talk about how this case could affect gender imbalances in college sports and how this could possibly affect Title IX and how schools allocate money to sports?
So
The question,
yeah, the question is about how this case could impact like gender imbalance and with Title IX and, you know, funding to men's and women's programs. I should start by saying I'm not a Title IX expert, but I've read, you know, different things from people and from Drexel University and so on and so forth. A lot of people, you know, go to the Title IX argument a lot, but I don't actually think it would impact Title IX very much. If anything, it would be great because then the women's players, you know, like would get more too. And I think that there's enough there that, you know, maybe it improves, you know, women's sports as well. So I personally have, if it's more, you know, money and funding and benefits going to athletes, men's programs, women's programs, I think that there's enough there to do that, and that would be, I view that as a potential, you know, net positive. You know, and in a lot of, you know, in women's basketball, for example, like I can guarantee you the fair market value for a lot of women's college basketball players when I was in college was much greater than mine was as a men's player at an Atlantic 10 school. So I think that there's you know, benefit to be had all around.
Yeah, and Abby, your question gets at, during some of the major litigations over payment of athletes, we have seen Title IX come up. But, you know, to that I would say, one is, if in order to comply with antitrust law, you can't comply with Title IX, then the school's doing it wrong. The schools should be obligated to do everything, right? They should follow antitrust law. They should follow Title IX. They should adhere to the rules. And if they can't come up with an arrangement that allows them to pay coaches all this money and still comply with various federal laws, then they need to redo how they're paying things. So one is that it's not a defense to antitrust claims. And then secondly, whether or not Title IX would be implicated is sort of an open-ended question. It really depends on how the athletes would be classified. If they were separate from the university as part of some kind of for-profit entity that plays sports, it's not clear that Title IX would be implicated. There's some debate among legal scholars who write about Title IX about that. But I would say, you know, Luke mentioned this, if the college football players are getting benefits, then there should be an assurance that there's gender equity in how those benefits are paid out or allocated. That Title IX is a very important law that has led to a dramatic increase in women playing sports. If you look at all of the data about women playing sports, the effect of Title IX has been excellent. I think if we look at promoting women athletes, and it should not be seen as a barrier to equity for economics either. And again, I think it gets back to the idea that to the extent that this is a complicated topic, there are smart enough people to resolve them.
Yeah, and I think that is a tactic that you see a lot with on the NCAA argument side, is they're masters at pinning kind of different groups against each other. So like you'll have like Title IX, and then it's like, oh, like let's pin, you know, women athletes against the basketball players and football players. But then like same thing happens with like they'll make threats about, you know, non-revenue generating sports, and you know try to really that really affects, you know, that really decreases, I guess, the level of empathy that people might have for, you know, a basketball player when you're really like pinning, you know, the rowing team against the basketball players when there's already, you know, elements at play of like jealousy and anger and stuff like that. But like my view on all that stuff too is like it's just really archaic and like impossible to like, it doesn't make sense to govern, you know, the rowing team at Duke, or they're probably world class, I don't know, but like the rowing team at Alabama, there's no way they have a good rowing team, right? And the football team at Alabama, it's just like totally different things. And you know, so like what's the solution to that? Yeah, it's complicated, but certainly it can be figured out.
We have time for one more question.
Yes.
Well, I've definitely reached the point where I agree that something with the compensation needs to change, but the ideas that I hear put forward, such as going to the Olympic model and letting someone like Marvin Bagley get sponsorships while he's still playing, but then someone brings up the counter arguments like what you were just talking about with the rowing team and stuff like that, and even with a basketball team at a lower level school like UMass or something like that compared to Duke. I guess, and just for closure, what would you guys recommend? What is your plan if you could just be in charge of the legislature? What would be the system that you would input?
The solution to all of these issues in one minute? Well, I would say, you know, you bring up and the question is about, the question ended with, if you could resolve it, what would it be? But prior to that, you mentioned endorsements and the impact that endorsements would have on college athletes. Would a college athlete who is clearly marketable getting an endorsement deal somehow make him or her different from other college athletes? Well, the money is coming from a third party, right? The money is coming from a company, presumably a private company that's paying the athlete. So the issue of inequity wouldn't be through the school or the NCAA. It would be an athlete is able to capitalize on his or her image and name and likeness. And that is the actual ruling from the O'Bannon case. And the ruling from the O'Bannon case should empower athletes to be able to do that. And I think it's really just a matter of time before we see athletes say, you know, look at the antitrust analysis in that case. Now, the NCAA, quote, resolved it, according to the Ninth Circuit, by allowing Division I men's basketball and football players to get full cost of tuition, that was the remedy to the antitrust violation. It was never clear why is that a remedy to the antitrust violation. But even assuming it is, I just think we're in an era where if we look at the O'Bannon ruling, and particularly if Jenkins wins as well, there would be analysis in those decisions that should allow a college athlete to get an endorsement deal. And also, if a college athlete can get an endorsement deal, that doesn't cost the school anything, right? So the idea, oh, where are we going to pay the athlete? It's coming from Electronic Arts or Ford Motors or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, obviously that's a huge question to solve, but in terms of a step in the right direction, first of all, there's always going to be complications. It's a professional industry. That's always going to happen. I think what you need to legitimately have is like, we'll call it a players association. There needs to be a formal entity that's outside of the NCAA that solely exists to represent the best interests of the players themselves. Because currently it's really unclear, like, whose interest does the NCAA really, you know, benefit? Well, it's pretty clear actually. But yeah, so I think like some sort of legitimate players association, you look at what's happened even with the NCAA board, you know, the NCAA only seems to respond to legal action, which is great for lawyers. It's an easy target right now. Or through like insane like negative PR pressure, right? So, you know, when following the Northwestern unionization attempt, the NCAA decided to add, you know, one player representative to the NCAA Division I Board of Directors. Great, they're hand selecting one person and there's 24 people on that board. Like, how's that gonna work out for the players? Just ask like the Democrats in Congress or something. I think that there needs to be like a real players association. And I don't think that's like a ridiculous request, and I think it can be figured out. I think it's still complicated, sure, but this is like beyond pay for play. Beyond that, there's other, you know, elements that are not covered right now. You saw the Michigan quarterback, you know, improperly treated for his concussion in his game at Purdue the other day, right? That was a nightmare. I read the article on it, and his parents said that they were upset because when they were checking into the hospital, the administrator asked like how they're going to pay their copay or something, and the father said, well, the NCAA bylaws require that the university covers it. That's not true. That's an assumption. NCAA bylaws, you know, relatively recent. It's within like the past 15 years that they even allow colleges to cover, you know, medical expenses related to on-field injuries. That's like only 15-ish years old.
And how about after they're done playing?
Right.
Right? Some of those injuries will be
Yeah.
with them for forever.
I got my tooth knocked out in a war rebounding drill my senior year, and I didn't need a root canal until the summer, and I'm out of college, and I don't have a job yet. I have to pay for that out of pocket, you know? So I think there's a lot of other issues that come into play when you're talking about, you know, some sort of players association. The other aspect of that is having a players association doesn't mean like all of a sudden players get everything they want, right? Oh, we're all getting $1 million. See you tennis, see you rowing. Like that's not the case. You create, you're going to create a system, and you're going to negotiate over these things. So you're just going to have better representation. And if there's a players association in existence, and players are like, nah, we're good, man. We're good with a, you know, cost of attendance check and, you know, full scholarship. Then personally, like I'm fine with that. I'll watch college sports. Great, good for you. But until that exists, and it's not just forced on the players, I have a hard time right now, and I find it deeply troubling how it currently exists. So I think that, you know, and then even in terms of the other schools, like when you think about any professional sports league, they all have different structures, and there's different revenue share models and so on and so forth. It doesn't necessarily mean like everything's going to Kentucky. There are people smarter than me that I'm happy to help advise in some way, but that can create something that I think will be a better system than what currently exists.
Thank you very much. We really appreciate you coming out. Thank you. Thank you.